Thanks. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks to the LA Film Forum for putting this together. I really enjoyed seeing these back to back. I don't think this is something I'd done before, so it brought up loads of questions, but we'll be sure to leave time as well for questions that there may be in the audience as well. What I wanted to start with, I guess, has to do with beginnings. This is, I guess, a whole body of work developed over a decade now, right? It's a long endeavor, like it's a life project, it's a living project as well, is the sense I've always had from our conversations. And I guess I wanted to ask a more intimate question about how the lives of rivers show up for you before all this starts as well. I think one of the things that's super strong in this work is the intimacy of those relationships that we weave with rivers, perhaps even before we know we're doing it. And perhaps there's things that you've reflected on over the years that were formative, in that sense, left impressions. And then maybe the more obvious question about maybe formally how this started, and started here, in fact, perhaps as well, and your experience living in California. So could you speak to those two?
Thank you. As a family, we always were close to rivers, and my grandfather taught me to swim in rivers. That's kind of a very big memory I have. I used to train swimming as a young person, as a child, and then as a young person. And swimming training is pretty much the pool coming back and forth without any currents to destabilize you. So when I was very young, I remember trying to cross a river in the same way that I would swim the swimming pool. And then one of the biggest teachers my grandfather did was like, no, you can't do that in a river. He grew up in rivers, and South American rivers, Colombian rivers are wide, brown, current, with a lot of current. He said, you have to let the river take you to the other side. And that was a really beautiful moment for me when I was like trying to cross the river in a straight line, and that's never possible, no? And so that's as a memory, but many times, like going out and doing what we call in Colombia paseo de olla, like bringing ingredients in a huge pot and making a fire close to the river. All the families get together, the cousins, and the big people, like the elders are cooking, and the young ones are running around and swimming. You saw a similar scene in one of the films too. So, and then my dad was grew crops also. So the river, or at least the irrigation system that depended on the river, was crucial to the family's economy. And that was really present too. Like if the river was dry, we knew that at home because money was less, or so many ways of that kind of quotidian relationship, economic, cultural, spiritual, to moments of learning. And formally, I think it's a continuation of an interest in public space and thinking about rivers as public spaces. So since I was at school in Bogota, to access public space as a space for doing art and for interacting with others has always been present in, kind of across my practice. And when I learned that the Magdalena River was being privatized by the construction of a dam, the El Quimbo Dam, we didn't see any film particularly dedicated to that, but there's other films in the body of work dedicated to the construction of El Quimbo Dam on the Magdalena River, or the Yuma River, which is one of its ancestral names. And it made me think about public spaces, not within the urban setting where I grew up, but in rural contexts, and rivers being a public space that unfortunately we have seen privatized in many ways. Similarly in Colombia or here in California, or also in unique ways in each of those contexts. And so I think that was the way I entered, but then once I started doing more fieldwork and researching about the construction of the dam, then I became more aware of the environmental impacts and all the environmental and social or environmental justice component of these struggles. So a little bit that way.
Yeah. I think it's fascinating that just the anecdote you share about having to let the river take you and not try and force our way across it is precisely the anecdote we see in the first film, right? Of the woman crossing the river. I think it's like very telling that's impregnated that memory there for other people as well. I have a question, I guess, about the specificity of film for you. So one thing that seeing all of these together really brought up for me is just how much your practice is an ecology of media, right? So there are so many moments when seeing the films, we'll see the water portraits, which are a series of these printed fabric mirrored images of portraits. We see them come up literally, right, enacted in one of the films, but we also see the way that the camera enables you then to fold images and pleat them. And this responds very much to the Serpent River book as a piece which is bringing together the folds and pleats of contact zones between the stories of rivers across different hemispheres, which is just so very potent, right, to recognize. And so I guess, what is it for you that film affords? What does it enable you to do, maybe specifically, as a medium as you approach it?
Well, I think in some occasions narration and telling a story from beginning to end, or at least a part of a story, that maybe in an artwork or a single standing artwork can be more complicated. The Serpent River book does that a little bit, no? But that's a book that it opens up like a river and also has, in a way, cinematographic moments, if you wish. But yeah, I think it's telling a story or the possibility of narration on one hand. I think the possibility of also letting go of the camera and let it do its own thing, like being an appendix of the eyes or something, or an extension of the eyes in a way that it's difficult to find in other mediums, maybe. Or being able, for example, to attach a camera to someone who's doing a gesture, right? And to be able to record that gesture from that weird point of view. So that's when you have the camera. But then also in the editing table, it allows for experimentation in the way of folding images or things. It allows me to do things that I could possibly never do in real life, which is to make a concrete dam wobble, right? In film, I can do that. I can make it wobble, or I can make it kind of become, explode in myriad patterns or something like that. So it does allow, and I think personally in this process, it did allow also to develop a more critical language towards given formats that you learn in the academy as an art student. One of them being landscape, and I've talked about this many times, but it was precisely in film by actually flipping the image of the river upside down or making it flow, not in how we're supposed to see it. If it's a cascade from the top of the frame flowing down to the bottom of the frame, but actually make it flow in another direction, to kind of undermine or mine directly the colonial gaze, right? The way that we're supposed to look at these natural entities through this mirror that we call landscape, that puts us outside of nature with the camera, and being able to flip it and to play with that image also in the post-production. I think it has become a tool for me to kind of unlearn the colonial gaze, to undo it, to repair.
Yeah, there's a lot of warping, certainly in the first film, right, which has to do with this kind of dismantling, right, of these structures that also seem so concrete, so solid, but in fact are built on these same mythologies that become perpetuated.
Yeah. And to muddy that gaze too, no? When you put the camera in the water and you stop having a clear image of something to muddy what we think we know, right? To like.
Yeah, and that was actually something I wanted to ask about, because it's one of the things we think about with water and kind of critical discussions around water, maybe in a more philosophical sphere, have to do with that opacity that water and rivers should retain, because precisely the technologies of the gaze have had to do with, whether through landscape harnessing the beauty of and composing that, or whether through the scientific or industrial gaze, mining for that information and composing that extractable data, right? But there needs to be that space also for not seeing. And of course, film is a visual technology that enables us to gaze. So kind of how do you play with that idea of, you mentioned the muddying. Is this something you think about with film as a medium?
Yeah, and in other pieces, and you see, for example, in some of the pieces here, in Agente Rio, the piece about Brazil, there's images of satellite photography also incorporated. So I do think I do think about it when I have access to this technology, or to satellite photography, or to drone filming. And it's about how do you hack the view from above, that view from power that is looking down onto us. So that's a question I pose when taking those kind of more aesthetic decisions or formal decisions. Also because it's I guess more transparent of also sometimes not knowing myself. In the creative process or in the formal process, and allowing that not knowing where I'm going to just take over too, not being afraid of that. And also because I know through learning and through being close to communities who are very rooted into a place, that sometimes there's things that you're not supposed to know either, and that they're better, or maybe some people, are allowed to know, and maybe other people, or me as a visitor or as someone inserting myself in a place, I don't need that knowledge, so it's not about we have to know everything. Some things it's okay if it remains mudded.
I think there's another thing that's really, really strong in your work, and that I was thinking about the relationship between the geochoreographies, so these more performatic pieces, and then the integration of choreography is kind of more of you're capturing that happening, and editing the film really to think about bodies in space, bodies with rivers, and the gesture, right? And the way in which our gestures are our habituated ways of inhabiting the world and expressing relation, aren't they? And the memory of those is embedded in our cells. And I think that what's so painfully moving about We River, Agente Rio, is that disarticulation, right, of that embodied coexistence with the river in the wake of the disaster in Mariana, for example. So this tailings dam ruptures in 2015, releases a muddy, toxic river of mud which engulfs these homes. And I think there's a sense of when you are filming that it feels you're off camera. There's a kind of joyful moment where you say "otra vez" to the woman who's panning for gold on dry land, and there are just these levels, I think, of poignancy in that approach to that ruptured coexistence that speaks to us, I guess, of what you're saying about not quite knowing when you go in what's going to happen. And I guess I have curiosity about that particular film because it does feel kind of off the cuff or intuitive and led by your connection with people and listening and being with as part of the process of making the film. So I guess a different type of filmmaker would go in knowing what they want and going for it and having maybe a plan. I guess to what extent is there room for chance, or do you have a kind of idea of what you're looking for?
Well, let me say that November 5th, that's coming up in 2 days, will mark the 9th anniversary of the break-in of that mine tailing dams. So just let's remember for a moment the 22 people who were killed by that mine tailing dam, and the rivers who have been contaminated, and the people who are still claiming housing. All these people who are given testimony have still not been properly compensated by Samarco or Vale, the criminal companies who allow that to happen. Yeah, there's a lot of chance, and there's a lot of relying on existing networks of affection too. So I do have to mention that the communities organized against dams in Brazil are coalesced under a national movement called the Movement of People Affected by Dams, who are also in association with people affected by dams in Colombia, where I'm from, people affected by dams in Brazil and Chile. So there's a huge Latin American network, and that is why I've been able also to access some of these spaces and have this intimacy, because I come through that network of organization, political action, mutual aid, and of affections, of empathy, and knowing that we are talking about the same things, them as people directly affected, and me maybe as an artist who has other set of tools and worries, but we're all pushing towards the same direction, which is the dismantling of dams and the freeing of rivers. And so that's a connection that, you know, allows, or people maybe feel trustworthy enough to allow me into their homes or let me ask them, like, you know, again, but just to talk about this particular moment, this filming happened perhaps 8 months after the breaking of the dam. And this was like a war zone. So you saw the like machinery cleaning up, still cleaning up, or supposedly cleaning up the toxic mud. These folks who used to go every day to the river more than once to fish, to wash, to meet their friends, to wash gold, suddenly for 8 months haven't been able to enter the river because of the heavy metals that the water was carrying. And even some people said, I don't mind, I just need to touch the water, and we're risking also, and you know, there was health issues going on because people were still wanting to get into the river even it was just so contaminated. And so when I was asking them, would you show me how you would wash gold? They would start, and then they would just, you know, they were telling me the story all the time. They had been, you know, very sad and afflicted, of course. But then when they started to do the panning, they would just brighten up and kind of remember and kind of feel maybe a little bit of connection, even if they were not doing in the river, but the memory of doing what brought them joy and brought food to the table just would brighten them up. And then we would just play and enjoy that moment of release, I guess, for them. That's how I felt. And that's how they would tell me after, oh, I hadn't actually touched, you know, my gold pan for 8 months, and it was so nice to actually touch it again. So that's how it happened. So yeah, it's very intuitive. And a lot happens, or the kind of the addition, the kind of the montage really happens in post-production, like bringing all the film, seeing it several times, and understanding what goes where happens in post-production. But there are some things that I'm focused on. For example, the gestures, yes. Asking people to kind of show them with the body, how do they, they repair something, and focusing on the hands. I'm very interested in the memory of the hands, or the hand muscle, how they function and how they work. Or when the brothers are showing how measurements are, you know, with the hands, like all that is, for me, is important, because one of the things I've learned throughout the years is that when an extractive industry comes to a place, it not only extracts our common goods, energy from a hydroelectricity project from the river, or minerals from the ground, or oil, or wood, or animals, or genetic material, our common goods, right? What happens is that the knowledge from our bodies is also extracted, because the connection with that land, that forest, that river is broken, and the knowledge that pertains to that connection suddenly cannot be embodied again. So people stop washing gold, people stop fishing, people stop growing food because they don't have access to that connection to the land. So that focus on the embodiment of knowledge is to open that conversation for us to think that sometimes we think that infrastructures function somewhere outside of our bodies, but they have direct impacts on our bodies and on the knowledge we carry in our muscles and that we have inherited from our grandmothers and mothers.
And I think the question around memory is so very important in all of these films as well, right? So there is that level of human memory, embodied and transmitted oral memory. And there's also the question of what it is that the water remembers. Scientists in precisely the Dose River, so the river that was destroyed, don't know how long it will take, if ever, for that river to recover, also kind of to process that trauma. And there's something very deeply painful and unjust about that. And I think it's important the way that that has a space in your films to come forward. And perhaps it's interesting to dwell on that from the perspective of the salmon, right? I think it's very powerful the way testimony expands in your films from the human voice to the narrative of this life world that has to do with the rupturing of ethical bonds of reciprocity and sacrifice, and the way that that is a relationship, that is what a relationship is, right, in terms of...
Contract.
Yeah, a contract, a natural contract, right, as Michel Serres would say. And so in bringing that other voice, it really pushes us to think about what a river is, insofar as it's so much more than the water, it's so much more than the riverine communities, right? It's a whole ecology of temporalities as well, and of other lives. And so maybe you could reflect on, I think the salmon poses a question of the people, what will you sacrifice? Could you maybe talk a little bit about reciprocity and sacrifice in your work?
Yeah. But first I want to talk about how the Kernaki people call the Dosha River is the river that got contaminated by the mine tailing rupture, the mine tailing dam rupture, the Dosha River. The Kernaki people who live along the river call the river Watu, which means grandfather, and the elders say that the river is not dead, but that when Watu, the grandfather, felt the toxic lava come, that Watu is way more intelligent than the toxic lava, so he buried himself under the riverbed and is waiting and is dormant for it to pass. What you say, we don't know how many years, but in the time span of a river, maybe it's a blink of an eye or two. So eventually Watu will emerge, when the toxic lava passes. Maybe we're not even here anymore, but Watu is there. And the reciprocity, that when I was doing field work and speaking with tribal members of the Shoshone Bannock and the Nez Perce, who are some of the tribes who interact and live with a snake river, and they're telling me the story about salmon's sacrifice and kind of our lack of sacrifice. All these ideas of pagamento, reciprocity that I've been also very interested in, and that comes up in some of my work, including one at the Vincent Price, one film that we didn't see here, but that is in the exhibition called Fuel to Fire. And I think that for me, making art is a way of reciprocity, or is my way, some of it, not all of it, but some of it, it is a way of giving back for sure. To some of these communities that host me, to some of these rivers too. But basically, going back to this idea of pagamento, which is the framework under which kind of I position myself to speak about reciprocity. Pagamento in Spanish means payback. And it's a fundamental economic and ecological protocol practiced by many native peoples across the Americas and across the world. In Colombia, we call it pagamento, which is to give back things that have value to us, to pay back for the services that nature offers to us, right? Because nothing in nature is for free. And if we don't pay it back, then accumulation happens from our side. And that's why we're so sick. That's why we're in the brinks of a collapse. Because we have not engaged in pagamento and paid back what has been given to us to maintain the balance and to maintain an equilibrium. And so, for me, that's a very kind of wise practice. I try to engage with it. And there's many ways and levels of pagamento. There's very established rituals among different indigenous communities. But I think all of us probably engage in some form of pagamento or not. But it's beautiful to think about what are the ways that we can give back from any profession that we, and any skill that we exert. What is the moment of giving back, or how can we incorporate reciprocity or pagamento into our everyday practices or our professional practices? It's a question I ask myself, yeah.
Great. Maybe it's just a moment to open it up to the public, and if there are questions, we can circulate the mic.
Any questions? Already
Thank you. Oh, hi, my name is Selene. Thank you for these films, so beautiful. I'm curious to hear if these companies that created these dams, I'm curious if they've responded to what you've created, because I think that these are, explicit statements on the impact of these dams on the well-being of these communities, as well as a disruption on the history of the knowledge that has been gained from the relationship of the rivers. So I'm curious if they've said anything and what.
I think they've responded to a bigger movement, not necessarily my films. I think my films are part of a bigger push that's going on. Like, we are witnessing right now the undamming of the Klamath River, like August 28th, the last dam of the Klamath River here in Northern California, Southern Oregon came down. So we're very lucky to witness here in the Pacific Northwest the biggest restoration rivers. And I must say that maybe these films are a little grain of sand into the big push of people who have working for decades for this to happen, no? So I think more than, maybe I twist your question a little bit, but I have seen that in the last decade, what we thought about dams has shifted dramatically, and that what we thought about hydroelectricity being a sustainable or green energy, a lot of people don't believe that anymore, and have realized that they are very damaging, to the extent that we're witnessing the repair and the undamming of rivers. So I am positive, and I'm hopeful that hopefully this movement that is kind of seeded here in the Pacific Northwest starts to spread throughout the Americas. But it's also a big question. While here in the United States, or the United States is the leading country in undamming and restoration projects, in the rest of the Americas, we're struggling and battling the construction of large hydroelectric dams, no? So it's a question to have, like, who is transitioning at the expense of who, is the question that, this brings up for me.
Thank you so much, Carolina and Lisa, Carolina, for your film work is just absolutely stunning. Thank you. And Lisa, thank you for this conversation. I'm wondering, Carolina, if you could talk about balancing the artistic expression in the film with the activism, especially because you're talking about kind of the Pan-American picture, and borders and water are so arbitrary. They don't really describe the big picture of things. And so I'm wondering how you approach that and that balance.
I guess also intuitively, there's not a really intuitively, and I guess there kind of the artistic freedom comes into place a little bit. And I was seeing Agente Rio, which is already a film but from 2016 or even one earlier that wasn't shown today that maybe has a more activist tone, Land of Friends, that's talking about the river in Colombia. I guess it has its own rhythm, you know. I think I need a interspeed sometimes, you know, or take turns. I don't know how to say. I think it's like this natural rhythm that doing a film that incorporates testimonies, which I think are the films that have a more activist tone in my work, is hard because you have to spend time in a place, you have to build relationships, which means, you know, having the resources, somebody commissioning it or something, toward, you know, in contrast to maybe films that can be done on your own, you know, with a camera. So I think it responds to also the possibilities you have at the moment, the resources you have at the moment. Yeah, the family situation of the moment. I don't know, I have a 4-year-old kid right now, so it's harder also to kind of maybe embed myself longer times as I could do the Brazil film, you know. Though I had an 8-year-old at that moment, I don't know how I did it. So I don't know, it's just like these natural rhythms that maybe, you know, start to appear in the film. And I guess also being comfortable in both, in like maybe having a film that has maybe a more, kind of clear message, like the reciprocal sacrifice. Are you willing to sacrifice too, right? Finishes with that question, to some that are more maybe poetic or abstract, like maybe Sowing Moisture, like the last one, that is more visual and sound, abstract, I guess. I don't know. I don't. For me, they come like these languages just like run with the same force, and I am not kind of maybe taking that decision prior, but the footage that is captured maybe informs how I approach it after. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for showing your films. It's great to see 10 years or more worth of work. I'm curious about your thoughts on filming and entering and working with cultures not your own, countries, lands, although, as the last person said, the borders are arbitrary and rivers cross many borders and waters cross many rivers. But there's always there's lots of risk in working with what you were talking about earlier, knowledges which might not be your own, which you might not need. Just, I'd like to hear kind of your thoughts on it directly. You've been speaking about it a lot from beside it, but yeah, just to hear that, thank you.
Well, I tend to be very transparent and honest before, you know, putting a camera on anyone, and being very, honest on explaining how possibly I could use this. Even if there's a verbal agreement, at least having that verbal agreement. I think I've never signed anything of release, actually, which can be a little bit awkward, I guess, for some people here. But because I'm not coming from that strictly documentarian training, maybe. So, as much as I can, I try to show the film after it's edited and finished to the folks who are in the film also before releasing it into the world. So that's a practice that I, take very carefully. Or if there's an organization involved, doing that. What can I say? For maybe a particular example to offer is the reciprocal sacrifice. To be able to incorporate Nimipu language, which is the language spoken by Tatlo at the beginning and at the end of the film, of the Salmon film, I had to go through a whole tribal consultation request for me to do research, because doing that film and working with the film language is considered an external researcher as any other person who's going to write a paper or publish something about the Nez Perce tribe. I had to go through the tribal council consultation, and I had to be approved by the tribal council. So the necessary protocols, if there existing protocols, I follow those protocols, and if they're not existing, I try to come up with those protocols, with protocols that make us feel well to all the parties involved. I think a lot sometimes about incorporating these knowledges that are not from my culture as citations, like the same way you would citate a paper or a book. No, this is knowledge. This is sophisticated knowledge that needs to be distributed, to counteract oppressive knowledge. I believe that. And to bring them into a film is to cite it in the construction of my own knowledge, is to cite my references, is to cite what has fed my own process. So in a more formal way, I consider them as citations, or in that world of, it's the way my train of thought is weaved, and so for me it's important to show that, like, what is the origin of that thought or of that film, or
Okay. Hi. I have a question that maybe will give an opportunity to hopefully circle through back to the show, but what was so beautiful about seeing these works is how they also speak to one another, and something that was nice seeing the ending with Sembrando Humedad, sowing moisture, is that it kind of opens pathways to other topics as well. You and I have spoken a lot about the work that you're interested in, have been with rivers and energy infrastructures and collapse as well, but there's also all these other through lines and the people you work with and the artists, environmental movements, and your artworks as well that have looked beyond collapse and looking at life too. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what Sembrando Humedad offers differently in this roster tonight, and some of the themes that have not been addressed.
Yeah, and let me just finish to the last question also. Actually, I think, I feel closer to some of these knowledges than to, French post-structuralism, to say. So it is my knowledge too, it's the knowledge of my continent. So, just to round up that idea. And Sembrando Humedad, it definitely poses something new, and I think that the exhibition also is showing a new perspective and a new positioning in my work, while a lot of the films you saw are part of a body of work that I call Be Damned, which plays with the verb to dam, to hold water, but to dam, to curse. We place life at the center, opens up, and that's a body of work that started 4 or 5 years ago, is actually repositioning myself from a place of loss and understanding what are the affectations of some of these issues, to a place of joy and abundance, and understanding what are the responses after the affectation hits you, and how people are able to lift themselves, gather themselves, respond, and troubleshoot, and move forwards, and transition. And Sembrando Humedad, the person who sings, Hemani Molina, she's a Shelknam woman from Caruquinca, from Tierra del Fuego in Chile, and one of the leaders of the Shelknam community on the Chile side, which until last year had been extinct. So in the official narratives of Chile, Shelknam people had been extinct, while right across the border in Argentina, the Shelknam people were recognized as an indigenous community. So, well, in the last decade, the Shelknam people have been able to remember, to fight for their recognition, and last year to actually have the Chilean government include them in the indigenous law of Chile, which means that now they are recognized as a living people with the rights to roam on their grounds. And so now we see Shelknam people establishing themselves again in the south of Chile. And Himani is one of these women, one of these leaders that until last year she was extinct as a Shelknam woman, and now she's actually officially recognized. And just to be able to, it's kind of has the same strength and witnessing the release and the freedom of the Klamath River, right? To see that actually we can change the narrative, and as artists and filmmakers and creative people or people who write or whatever, that we actually have the force and the power to change the narrative. Of course, not on our own, but if we make good allies and we collaborate, we can change narratives for sure. We've seen it, we're witnessing it here with all the amazing land back examples that we're witnessing here in California, in Southern California, northern riverbacks, the release, the freedom of the Klamath is nothing but a riverback, and it's part of land back, of course. And we're seeing it in the south of the continent too. It's happening all across the continent. And so that's what the exhibition offers if you have a chance to visit. It offers you that change of perspective. If you're familiar with my work, you will see that change of perspective, but it offers also artworks and creative expressions from different organizations and artists and communities who are leading transition. And when I talk about transition, I'm not referring only to energy or electricity transition, like we're talking about something wider than what is called the Green New Deal here in the United States, or energy transitions, but we're talking about an eco-social transition where the way we access food and water and land and energy is shifting, or at least there's a lot of people pushing for that shift, for sure. Maybe it's not shifting as quick as we need, but we're working on it. Thank you.
I think we can, this mic is so loud. I think we can end here, everyone. Thank you so much, Carolina, for your amazing work, and Lisa for this conversation. And please check out Carolina's exhibition in Vincent Price Arts Museum. Thank you.